what we're seeing as we came down this way, Dr. Beck spoke a lot about really it comes down to economics. The whole theme that we're seeing is the economics of feeding this hay. I know it was touched on earlier about the amount of effort that we go to put up good quality hay, or if you don't have the equipment, you know, you pay for good quality hay. You look at maybe the TDN, you look at the nutrient, you know, how it's, what do you got for protein. We're paying different prices for hay, and we go to all this work and effort and investment, and then when it comes to feeding it out, sometimes we can be a little wasteful. So as we move on down this direction, I guess really what we're going to do is continue that that conversation about really the economics of feeding hay. And we wanted to look at a couple of different methods, kind of linked to what Dr. Beck spoke of as far as getting the nutrients spread out onto the pasture, and being able to stretch everybody out, get everybody good access to feed, and try and make another step towards forage efficiencies. So they spoke a little bit about feeding in hay rings compared to unrolling hay. And there would be a lot of people here that would unroll hay with maybe a bale bed, and you unroll it with, you know, the width of the bale. So if you've got a 4-foot wide bale, you lay down a 4-foot wide strip of hay, and it unrolls as far as it unrolls. Or it might be a 5-foot wide bale, so then you got a 5-foot wide strip. Part of the presentation, I guess, today is we want to introduce what might not exactly be a new style of feeding, but it's entirely different. And I think you guys will find it very interesting to watch the reaction of the livestock in relation to the way we feed it. So we've got a couple of pieces of equipment here to help us demonstrate it. And what we're doing really differently is obviously different from a hay ring in terms of being able to spread it out into the pasture instead of compounding all those nutrients into a single area and growing pigweeds, as Dr. Beck taught us. But what we're going to do is show it where we're actually stringing it out into the pasture, but instead of unrolling it in a 4-foot wide or a 5-foot wide strip, where a lot of that wastage comes in because, well, we all know the reaction of our boss cows. They follow you, and they're always looking for the best part of the bale, and then there's a lot of, you know, they're walking right up the red carpet, you might say. They're standing on it, crapping on it, peeing on it, and then using it for bedding. So we want to try and avoid that, and one thing that has really helped that is being able to take that windrow and just stretch it out. So instead of having just a fixed amount of space that we can unroll a bale of hay, and having a fixed width of a windrow of 5 feet wide or however wide our bales are, we're actually turning that bale 90 degrees, as you can see here. And we're just gently teasing that hay and fluffing it up to make it nice and palatable and pull it off the bale, but we're dropping it into maybe, let's say, an 18-inch windrow. So what we'll see, Angus here is he's come all the way over here from a little country you maybe didn't even know it existed. It's called New Zealand. So meet Angus. He's gonna be running the tractor, and he's gonna run out there and show us how it works. But essentially what we're going to do is try and make a slightly taller and a much narrower windrow that gives us more quote-unquote bunk space. So you give everybody access, especially as they spoke of when we're calving. Got young calves around, if we can string them out, it keeps things a little safer, and then it gives everyone equal access to feed, so that it's not just your boss cows that are getting the best part of that bale. A couple things to pay attention to when Angus is feeding it out is to look at, number one, the windrow, obviously going to be much narrower, but then we'll watch the cattle's reaction to instead of walking right up on top of the hay. It's not to say they don't step on it, but they tend to walk next to it, and then when they find the spot where they want to eat, you just watch them, and they turn and they go down and they eat. And so I think what's really contributing to a lot of these reducing the waste factors, which there's a handout I think that maybe you all got. We built a little calculator, and it's all based off of a comparison of different feeding methods using some of the findings that Dr. Lallman's had, some of the findings that Dr. Beck's found, and then some other studies from University of Georgia, and then also the University of Alberta, Canada. So let's have some fun. Let's go see some of the equipment run, and we'll pay attention to how these cows react to it. We did feed out here last night at about 5 o'clock. We fed right along these 2 temporary fences. And so I think what we'll do to start with is we'll go out there and we'll take a look at what's left over. We can string it out just as though we would when we're unrolling it with, say, a bale bed. We can string it out just in the middle of the pasture. Otherwise, another factor that helps with wastage is to utilize a temporary fence or even a fixed fence. But temporary works well, which we're going to have some demonstrations on that later. But the one advantage that it does is when you can string a windrow real close to the fence line, they can really only get at it from one side, so they're not going to be standing on it. It just reduces the opportunity for them to trample it into the ground. So take a look at the ground, see there's a little wastage left over. They've done some sorting, but we're gonna watch Angus as he goes up and feeds along this fence line. A couple different ways you can do it. If you can go inside the pen and feed right along the right along the inside of the fence line, or if you have a temporary fence like this, I think Angus is going to show us. But you can actually hang the side chute over top of the wire and just drop it right inside, so you're not even opening any gates. You're just feeding along from the outside. So as you can see, what's happening here is he's just gently teasing the hay off. Works a little different than a traditional flail type processor. Instead of chopping up the hay and beating it to bits, we're just being a little bit more gentle with it and trying to just tease it off, pull it off the hay bale without pulverizing it. Some of the reactions of the cattle, they tend to stand at it more perpendicular, so it's like they're eating out of a bunk. Obviously it keeps a lot less trampling off of the hay. Take a look at the windrow here. When you look at this hay, one thing that machine's doing a little differently than a traditional flail type processor is we're not chopping the hay. In some cases chopping is good. A lot of cases, if we have average to good quality hay, we want to keep it long stem for the reasons that Dr. Lallman spoke about, as far as being able to, if we can keep the hay in the digestive tract longer, it gives the good bugs, the microbial activity is much higher and longer. So it helps them to capture and absorb more nutrition from the feed. So we've put a lot of time and effort into the hay that we're putting it up. Let's help these cows get everything we can out of it. So part of that is just keeping it long stem. I think, could you tell us a little bit about that study that you've done on long stem? Do you mind giving us a little?
What impact does chopping or even grinding hay have on digestibility and feed intake? It's interesting, the more you process it, the more they eat. Kind of makes sense. But the more you process it, the less they digest. So kind of offsetting factors there. Chopped hay, 2 to 6 inches, you'd have 3 to 4% reduction in digestibility. Ground hay would be more in the neighborhood of 5 to 6% reduction in digestibility. So that's kind of that in a nutshell, Lance.
Last night we fed about very similar size windrow right along the same side to these exact same batch of cows. So you can look at the ground to see what's left over. They have done some sorting and left some stems behind. But with that machine, you do have a lot of control over the size and the makeup of the windrow, because you've got rotor speed that's actually spinning the bale and pulling the hay off. You can control that hydraulically. You've also got the amount of pressure that you squeeze that bale up against those rotors. You've got that control hydraulically, and then of course you've got ground speed. When I'm feeding out like he's doing here, just out in the middle of a pasture, I tend to want to string it out in a longer windrow, so I'll just increase my ground speed a bit and get that windrow much narrower. And because part of the reason is when you watch the reaction of those cattle, when they come along to a windrow like this, if it's in the middle of a pasture, this is getting pretty thick, and they will actually tend to stand on it a bit. Whereas if you have a much narrower one, they won't. They tend to look at it and they almost come up to it like a bunk, and they eat it and move on.
Have you ever fed it just in a pile, stop, pull ahead 10, 20 feet and do it again?
Yes, we have done that, and it's a little bit more like the results of feeding with an unprotected bale. They will tend to want to walk in it and stand in a little bit more.
Even just in a pile?
Even just in a pile. They'll tend to stand around it, but still you get some that will, because there's an excess amount of feed just right there, they tend to be a little bit more wasteful. So if you give them, a mouthful and a mouthful and a mouthful, and you just string it out, they tend to just want to clean up what's right there and then move on. There's a set of integrated hidden bale spears inside this machine. What he's going to do is he's going to back up over here and put the platform down that the bale sits on, just like he's doing now. Put that platform all the way down, which triggers a little lever, and when he sets the machine down on the ground, it automatically detaches from the tractor. You don't have to unplug your hydraulics, you don't have to pull any levers, you don't have to do any, unhooking, it just unhooks itself. And then he pulls away and he's left with a set of integrated hidden bale spears that pull out of the machine, which then he goes and stabs his bale. Got two options. We can either take the net wrap off now, which is what we recommend. Sometimes, I shouldn't mention this, especially with Dr. Lallman looking at me, but if you want, you can leave the net wrap on, and this top rotor will actually tear it off. Most of it will end up on the rotor, which can easily be pulled off just by pulling these two latches and lowering this here. That comes out, you just slice that and pull it back off, but the problem with that is you do have the potential to drop some net wrap out in the pasture. And last I checked, cows were not invented to eat nylon, so better to take it off before, which we'll do. The way that to keep it long stem but yet fluff it up nice enough where it's good and palatable for them and easy to eat. It's got two rollers on here, as you can see, and they've both got teeth on them that are timed, and every time the bottom rotor goes around once, the top rotor spins around 3 times. So what happens is you get this activity where the bottom rotor is actually starting to unroll the bale, just like a typical bale unroller. But then the key to it is this top roller going 3 times faster is it's just gently teasing that hay apart. It's wanting to pull the hay off faster than it's unrolling. So that's what really fluffs it up and puts it back into that raked windrow texture, and it just comes over the edge and falls down. This here is an optional side chute that just allows you to direct the hay a little bit more directly into a specific spot. So as we leave here, which will be right now, he'll set this down, and you'll see what he'll do is he'll slam back into this machine and then lift his table up, and it just locks everything in place back on his machine. And then he'll just drive out. We can follow him, and he'll do a little bit of bunk feed. And this really helps a lot for just giving you a little bit more clearance to feed into, if you're feeding hay into bunks. Is there any other questions before he fires up the tractor?
If you wanted to do this on a smaller scale, let's say you don't have a massive operation just yet, how would you do that?
She's asking if we wanted to feed this way in a smaller operation. Yeah, you don't have a lot of. Are you thinking not a lot of land to spread it?
Well, not a lot of cattle to invest in.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
So one thing that would help with that is we've built an economies of scale. Basically, it's a calculator that allows you to plug in the number of cows that you have, and how much hay you're feeding, and how many days your hay feeding season is. And what it does is it helps you could actually plug in either the cost of the hay ring, or you could plug in the cost of the machine. And it actually has a depreciation calculator in there to show you the depreciation of the machine and what it's worth after 5 years or after 10 years. And that actually is figured all into the expense of feeding the hay, and then it just spits out a number at the bottom, and it allows you to compare that to, maybe the really cheap bale ring, or maybe the smarter bale ring, or something like this, or maybe a flail type processor, or a hay unroller like was spoke of before. So maybe what would be a good thing to do is maybe at lunchtime, when we all gather around for lunch, we'll have a dedicated person. Not sure who that is yet, but we'll have them come around, and if you want, you can sign up for. We'll send you the calculator that calculates all that out for this whole project, and you can plug in and do the numbers for yourself.
So what's the cost of the machine there?
So there's several different types of machines. Something like this is typically somewhere around $12,000, $13,000, depending on what size you get. We make different sizes. You can get a smaller, compact one for if you're only doing 4-foot wide bales. This is a bigger one to do any 5x6, up to 5x6 bales. And then there's, obviously we make a lot of different machines, so you can get up into 2-bale. There's a 2-bale machine up there where we'll eat lunch. You can take a look at that. That's something more, a little less than 20 grand for something like that. And then obviously we make big wagons for if you need to haul and feed out 8 bales at a time, you can get something like that. So, and then even that one, the front end loader one that we showed earlier, that's something that you can pick up for actually less than 10 grand. So there's a lot of different machines, kind of an answer to your question, for different size operations. And obviously the return on investment is going to be faster or slower depending on what you got.
Lance, what's the normal maintenance on this machine?
That's a good question. So he asked about maintenance. I guess the one thing that attracted me to it is the simplicity of it. That was one of the things that attracted me to it. There's not a lot of moving parts, so maintenance is mostly just keeping it greased. There is bearings, closed bearings, seal bearings on each end of both drums. So you've got grease zerks there, and then the pivot point of the table, there's grease zerks there. Other than that, there's very, very little maintenance, not a whole lot of moving parts, and it's not a lot of high power, horsepower PTO stuff. Everything is hydraulically driven, so it's a lot more consistent power. There's not a lot of vibration. One thing that obviously, I don't know if many people do use flail type processors, but sometimes those machines can have a lot of vibration or a lot of horsepower going to them. A little bit more opportunity for some higher maintenance costs. This has just been a fairly simple, just keep it greased.
So, is the fluffer, is that gear driven then? It says chainless.
This is a good question. So, as you would have seen when we fed out with the first machine, that feeds the bale by having basically feeder chains that are going underneath the bale. It's got these feed bars that have teeth on them, and so that's what we call our chain feeders. This one here is called the chainless bale feeder, and ironically, underneath this cover that says chainless is a set of chains. So it's the chainless is in reference to what's actually feeding the bale, but yes, there's the hydraulic direct drive motor that runs one of the rotors, and then there's a timing chain that runs the other rotor to keep that 3-to-1 ratio. So that's a good question.
Will this handle a square bale?
That's a very good question that I forgot to cover. This chainless machine is designed to do any and every bale. It's taken a lot of years. We've been in business since 1961. This invention came out in the early 90s. It's taken us a lot of time to get that down, but we think we've made some progress on that. And it will feed out big squares, big rounds, small rounds, wet, dry, pretty much anything you have. So I don't know if there's anybody that does baleage around here. It's kind of dry hay country, but it'll feed baleage. And to answer your question, yes, it'll feed out big squares.
How does the square bale fit in there? What angle is it?
Good question. So how the square bale sits on it is it actually sits long ways, so the end of it really face plants into the rotors. So it hangs out the end. If you've got 6 foot long bales, it'll fit on the table as it is. If you have 3x4x8s or 4x4x8s, you need just a table extension on the end to capture that last couple of feet of the bale. this one here, same thing, except this one actually